Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on empowering employees to enable sustainable productivity. I'm Julia King, a business and technology journalist, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. And now, about our topic. Many organizations know they can use data insights to empower employees and enhance productivity, but they may need some help turning that knowledge into daily practice. Today's webinar is all about how to enable sustained productivity for long-term value. We'll be talking about how empowered productivity provides genuine competitive advantage and why leveraging productivity data to support employees has evolved from a nice to have to a business necessity. We will also explore the process of defining practices and norms for using performance analytics, including balancing desired outcomes and ethical considerations. Employers and employees alike can use this approach to stretch beyond their comfort zone and achieve meaningful growth in the new world of work. Our presenters today are Gabriella Mauk, who is Vice President at ActiveTrack's Productivity Lab. This is a dedicated team focused on helping organizations transition to a productivity-oriented mindset. Gabriella joined ActiveTrack following a very successful career in the consulting firm world, where she focused on organizational effectiveness, leadership, and design. She shifted from the consulting world into the corporate world as a means to bring these organizational insights and strategy and solutions to life. Michael Schrag is visiting scholar with MIT's Sloan Initiative on the Digital Economy. Michael also serves as an advisor on innovation issues and investments to major firms and presents workshops worldwide on design experimentation and innovation risk. Gabriella, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Let's start by going over the agenda today. It's a fairly simple one. We'll spend our time doing three things. First, we'll lay the foundation for understanding just what empowered productivity is. And then we'll shift the conversation into understanding why this type of empowered productivity and sustainable productivity is a necessity and not simply a nice to have. And we'll close out by talking about what we call the reframe, which is reframing the collection of these types of activities and this type of productivity monitoring in a way in which we are enabling and empowering our workforce in a positive way that elevates culture in the way that we'd like to see it elevated. What I want to do is I want to start with a poll. And that starts with, before laying the foundation here, really understanding from you here in the audience whether or not you get the insights you need in order to manage productivity. So do you get the insights you need from the productivity metrics today?
Just to append this, that is to say, from the productivity metrics you use, how much value are you getting from them? Yes, not really, no, we don't really measure it, or we're evaluating.
Great. I think as we wait for people to fill out this poll here, I find this question really interesting because I ask it all the time, right? And so I had a conversation, with a customer just recently who started the conversation by saying that they already got the metrics that they need. And so when I probed further, I asked, well, when you think about those metrics, are you able to get insight into things like burnout, fatigue, distractions in your workplace? And very quickly into that conversation, it became clear that while they felt they were getting the productivity metrics they needed, they weren't getting insight into some of those topics I just mentioned, which I'm excited to explore on how they're connected as we have this conversation today. So let's close out the poll and see what we have for results. Great. All right. So what we see here, and Michael, I'm curious to hear your reactions, is we have 36% that don't holistically measure productivity today. For me, it's a good starting point for today's conversation because we'll acknowledge the fact that we're not necessarily there today, but we're certainly here to understand how we can get there. Anything, surprising to you, Michael, when you look at the other groupings here?
No, I'm not going to say that I'm surprised at all. I think it's consistent with a lot of the classes and research that we've done. I'm not surprised that they don't holistically measure, because that really is new, and you're really going to discuss some of the reframing aspects. I admire the quarter that say no, they don't get the insights they need. That's probably why they're here, and hopefully they'll come away with a good approach. My concern is with the 20% that says no, not really, they're good enough. We'll see if good enough is good enough. And for the yes, if the organizations that really are getting the insights that they need, please comment in chat and let us know, because that's going to be the nucleus of some of the conversation going forward. So I'm very glad that we did this poll, and I'm looking forward to your building on it, Gabriela.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is a great starting point. Let's set the stage for what empowered productivity is and what it has looked like in the past and how we can think about it differently. When we think about productivity, we think about it in the form of a ratio, which is inputs to outputs. And so when we think about effective productivity, we see a world in which we're able to maximize those inputs to efficiently achieve outcomes. And those things that enable it include people, process, and technology. And so when we think about measuring productivity in the digital era, we have to recognize that when we measure productivity in the digital era using what we refer to as industrial era metrics, it stunts productivity. Let's talk about how it does that. So when we think about industrial era metrics, we think about those metrics that are machine-centered. They look at things like output, downtime, uptime, hours, and schedules. When we think about digital era metrics, we shift our attention to those that are more human-centered. We start having conversations around outcomes rather than output. We think about things such as ideas and creativity, culture and engagement, and health and well-being. Now, the problem here is that when we use industrial era metrics in a digital era, what we find is that we find ourselves cultivating an environment in which there's mistrust between the employer and the employee. There's a misinterpretation of employee performance, a misconception that work can only be achieved during specific hours. We devalue individual skills and capabilities, and there's a general disregard for personal preferences. Now, I'm sure to many of you this sounds familiar, particularly those who are up against this challenge of deciding whether or not you're bringing people back to the workplace or you're allowing them to continue to work from home with a far more flexible schedule. When we use these industrial era metrics, we see a decline in these topics that are really important for us as we think about managing the culture and the environment and ultimately the productivity of our workforce. And so when we see a decline in these things, we ultimately see a decline in productivity. Now, while productivity goes down, we recognize that the costs add up. And that's why a lot of you are here today and prioritizing a conversation like this one to better understand how we can better measure the activity that's going on in our workplace so that we can create a better environment in which our employees are empowered and so that we can ultimately drive productivity up rather than down. And so some of us have begun this shift, but there's more to be done. Because when we know that when we use industrial era metrics, it ultimately minimizes the employee. It's very mechanical, it's very one size fits all. Now, some of us have moved to the right side of this spectrum, and we've started using metrics 2 or 3 times a year where we can get a better understanding of the degree of engagement of our workforce. We can understand whether or not they're feeling burned out, whether or not they're feeling as if they're safe in their current environment, able to be productive, have the tools they need, executing on their processes, etc. But these forms of measurement are reactive. They're not necessarily proactive. And then for those of us who have found ourselves perhaps in that percentage of you who have said yes at the start of today's poll, those of us who are on the right-hand side of the spectrum are beginning to use digital era metrics that elevate and empower our employees. And those are those metrics that we'll talk about today that focus on well-being and engagement, and they're outcome focused. Now we know it's counterproductive to measure employees like we do machines. It's not acceptable to support and listen to only some employees a handful of times a year. But what your workforce needs is metrics that enable tailored, timely, and relevant support. And so that leads us to our second poll as we sort of close out laying the foundation here before Michael and I get into some more dialogue. And so I'm curious from you, so after sort of listening to the distinction here between industrial era metrics and digital era metrics or human-centric metrics, how would you characterize the metrics that you're using today? One of the things that I'm eager to see here is
I regret the fact that we didn't have an option being a bad measure, a bad combination of both, but we'll do that next time.
Yeah, I probably was going in the same spot, Michael, which is curious for
You're
those
just a
of us
nicer
that use
person
industrial
than I
era.
am. Things. Yes.
Let's give it a couple more seconds.
But I do think one of the points that I'm going to call out more explicitly, Gabriella, is when you were going from the historical to the contemporary on this, from the industrial to the digital, the fact of the matter is most of these productivity metrics really are trying to be agnostic to whether the productivity comes from a person or a machine. And I think one of the most important things we observed through the COVID pandemic is that perhaps that oversimplification creates certain issues. And I think your semantic point about the difference between output and outcomes is a big one, not just rhetorically, but as what it is we're seeking to measure. So I'm going to be very curious to this poll as well. That's an interesting mix.
That is a very interesting mix. What's interesting is I was in a situation recently where I was having a conversation with someone who was explaining to me that they felt that they were disappointed because they were using industrial era metrics and they were using their productivity data to understand when people, started their day and when they ended their day and how many hours they worked in between. And so I explained to them that that does feel like a very industrial era metric. You're seeing how long people were at work. But you could take that same exact data and you could use it for more human-centric insights. You could use that data to understand whether or not that person typically worked 8 hours a day and over time was working 9, 10, 11, and 12. You could use that data to understand, do they need more training? Do we need more headcount? Are they on the risk of burnout? Do I need to have a conversation with them? And so what's interesting about these results, and I'd encourage the audience to ask themselves this question: am I taking data and producing industrial era metrics out of them? And can I use this data, the same data that I might already have today, and create more human-centric insights that can be more powerful for my environment? So that's exactly what we did with this individual's business, as we started having a conversation around how you could use that same input of data and start collecting more human-centric findings from it.
Gabriella and Michael, I'll let you know that we have a comment here, which I think is apropos at this point, where someone in our audience is saying that they're not sure whether there's a real division between industrial era metrics as opposed to digital era metrics, but rather that there was a lack of human metrics. And when the perspective became wider, these metrics are aggregated, not necessarily replacing former productivity metrics.
Okay.
Well, that's an interesting point. If you can go back to the poll again, I don't think there's any question that we're beginning to see more hybridized definitions of productivity. But the purpose of this poll was to talk about the level of emphasis, industrial era oriented versus more human versus a good combination. We did create that option there. And finally, the not sure on this. I would like people not just to ask questions on this, but to comment on this. Are they happy with their human-centric metrics? Where do they feel frustration regarding the organizational emphasis on the industrial? Does that emphasis of the industrial come at the expense of the human? Just to foreshadow one of the issues that Gabriella and I will discuss, and I should point out this is like the third webinar that we've done, and we've observed certain patterns. One of the patterns we've observed is that there are organizations that say human-centered metrics, that's HR's jobs. Industrial era metric, that's the businesses unit. So you actually siloize and separate wellness, productivity, sustainable productivity, the role that people play in productivity. And the reason why we're doing these kinds of polls is we're trying to set up that conversation, set up that Q&A, which is coming sooner rather than later. But this is a very interesting spread here. And I would also like to hear from the not sure people on this, because if there's anything that you absolutely need to make metrics work and to get insights from them, you need clarity around the definition and the purpose of those metrics.
Yeah, one of the things I would also add to and on that comment, Julia, is that hopefully it ties back to the story I just shared. The data might not always be different. The metrics and the insights that we derive for it need to make a shift from being more industrial era minded to more digital era minded. It needs to be a shift away from the output and towards the outcome. And that absolutely is a distinction that I am definitively saying that I think has changed in the recent years. Let's keep going. So what we're going to talk about today is the solution to this, right? What are the digital era metrics and how can I think about them in the way that can support my workforce? And what we're saying is that this solution is a set of workforce first metrics. Its sustainable productivity requires ongoing human-centric measurement designed to empower in real time, all the time. And so the idea
I'm going to call you out here, Gabriela.
Sure.
So what you're saying is, if you really care about workforce metrics and having them be of good quantity, appropriate quantity and quality for insights, you need to commit to monitoring, tracking your workforce in real time more often than not random sampling or occasional sampling or even daily sampling.
That's right, Michael. But I think what I don't want to be lost in that statement is that along with that commitment comes a series of other commitments that leaders have to make, which I think tees us up for this conversation. We need to make a commitment to collecting this data on an ongoing basis. We also need to make a commitment to including our employees in that conversation and empowering them along the way. Let's keep going. Let's talk about it. What we're going to have a conversation now, really as a segue right to Michael's point, is this the statement that this is a necessity, not a nice to have. And so what I want to do is I want to start with sharing a story. And so I was working with a particular company. This company's a clothing company based in California, 60 factories worldwide. They were strongly considering a back in office work policy so that they could, quote unquote, return to normal. That being said, their workforce didn't want to return to normal. In fact, what they wanted was the flexibility to be able to work from home. Now, I'm sure for many of you, this is a storyline that resonates with your own organization as well. And so this particular company was at a crossroads, and their employees, quite frankly, were growing tired of it. They had tried being back in the office. They had tried, certain days a week at work, and it wasn't clear what the policy was going to be. And so they made the decision to leverage workforce first metrics to understand the difference between those that were working in the office, those who were working in a hybrid setup, and those that were working remote. And so what they wanted to understand was the variation in productivity habits. And what they learned is that those that were working from home had healthier productivity habits. And not only did they then make the decision to keep their workforce at home, but they expanded their work from home program far more broadly and allowed them to hire talent in a far more geographically dispersed environment. And so that they learned with this level of detail into the productivity behavior of their
workforce. A question here, Gabriela. Can you just be a little more detailed about what a healthy work habit was in terms of how they allocated their time?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. So what we
were being actively tracked. So yes.
What we were seeing in that data was a larger the tendency to have more of a routine the tendency to, be more consistent day over day in those working hours and have more of that productive time activity that they were looking for. And so that was showing up more clearly in those that were able to work from home and have that flexible work schedule than those that were back in the office. The ancillary benefits in this account wasn't not only that they were able to have better insight into where people should be working, but they were also able to see where they needed to add headcount to their team because people were working too much, a level of visibility that they otherwise would have never had, or where they were seeing they could curb burnout as a result of providing more support where they needed it, which is something that would have been hard to see had they not had that ongoing level of insight.
Just out of curiosity, did they use it to try to predict churn? Did they correlate it to churn or departure numbers?
They did not. They used it to avoid churn by taking on things like burnout head on, but certainly not to predict
Very
it.
good. Thanks.
So let's talk about what that human-centered measurement is. When we think about the data, we think about technology usage, working location, productive activities. That data leads us to insights that allow us to better manage our workforce, better empower our workforce. That allows us to see how behaviors change in the hybrid workplace. It allows us to see where we have fatigue risks, distraction sources, and the ability to get time, allocate time towards both focusing and collaborating. So the piece here that I want to call out is that if we're only looking at the data and we're not driving to the insights, the use of this ongoing measurement falls short from what we ultimately need it to be able to do, which is to empower our employees. I'm curious for those of you in the audience here, as you're listening to this, Michael and I have made a very strong point for the need for collecting information like this on an ongoing basis so that you can be more proactive rather than reactive. How often does your organization collect data to inform productivity and well-being? Do you do that on an ongoing basis, a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, or do you not know or not do this?
Those of you who are calling in from Europe, you don't have to answer. We don't want you prosecuted by the EU.
While we wait for an answer there, we do have a comment from Margaret who says she consults with HR professionals, and what's ironic is that most of their metrics are industrial era. They love to collect activity data and time-based data, but struggle with gathering behavioral data. And maybe that's something that we can talk more about in the Q&A part.
Absolutely. I very much appreciate it. It's just that Margaret and I have different perceptions. What she calls ironic, I would call perverse. But I do hope that she has comments and questions on that, and we get to develop that when we finish our call to actions shortly.
It's not a wild surprise to me, and I feel like we'd be remiss not to bring it up in this conversation, which is the times that we're in terms of the Great Resignation. I would go so far as to say is that mismeasurement or wrongfully placed measurement done by these organizations is leading to missing the ability to identify when you have these leading causes for why people are leaving your organization. All right. Wow. On the whole, not a tremendous amount of frequent measurement that's going.
I'm surprised by this. And we're going to, just to foreshadow, I'm not shocked, but very surprised that by the I don't know, we don't do this is so high. Okay? Because if you don't know or you don't do it, there's certain things, certain decisions or insights you can't make born of ignorance on this. So this is really a very important set of numbers, and the call to action that you're going to hear really is probably going to challenge your organizational norms on this. Gabriella?
Yeah, that I don't know category is such a, it's too loose of a box for me, now that I'm looking at the poll, because the truth is, if your organization is doing it and you don't know, you will quickly see in the following slides that that's a problem, right? And they're
Exactly
collecting
right.
that data and they're doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily involve you in it. So I'm imagining that could be a percentage in this group. The other percentage could certainly be we don't do this at all, which is a whole set of other sort of ramifications and concerns that I might have. So yeah, I'm a little bit disappointed that this is a bit of a black box in terms of this category, but it's certainly a high number. If we look on the other side of this poll, we have a very low number that's doing this on an ongoing basis. And I'd love to hear from this group in the chat how they're doing this and why they're doing this, to add to some of our Q&A conversation in a little bit here.
But
my suspicion for those who are doing this quarterly are thinking more about perhaps their engagement data or something of that source, that's guiding to that answer.
But my point on the near 60% is there is no way you can make an empowerment argument if you're not doing it or you don't know. If the employees don't know, if you don't know, that's a big issue. That's a very big issue. We're going to address that issue, but that's a very, very large number.
Agreed. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about how we reframe this for empowerment. So those of you who have, followed along with us and thought this makes sense, or at least I would hope that's a conclusion that we're bringing you along on, which is the fact that these metrics need to change. But I'm reluctant to, and this is a story I hear far too often throughout my week, I'm reluctant to adopt these types of metrics because I think that they could be disruptive to my workforce. And so I want to take that argument head on here today, which is by starting with an outline of really the principles that need to exist to operationalize this concept in the workplace. There are three main principles: transparency, access, and action. And these are the three things that Michael and I believe need to be in place in order for you to bring this type of measurement into your organization. You need to be transparent with your workforce on why you're collecting this type of data. You need to give access to this data to your individuals and your managers so that they can see it, understand it, and process it. And then you need to make sure that you're making adjustments real time. So for those companies that are most effective in adopting this more progressive form of measurement, they're not just collecting the data and looking at the insights, but they're modifying their policies real time. They're modifying the challenges that are in the way of their workforce. And that's ultimately what makes this a productivity metric and not a pure engagement metric.
But I want to actually go further than what you just did. And actually in our conversations, you're usually more vociferous on this than I. I don't know why you're erring on the side of polite today. These are not just you should be transparent, you should facilitate access, and you should take action. You need to be proactive around this. You need to market transparency within the organization. You need to make access easy and clear to everyone. You should be promoting the sharing of this, and you should be making clear what actions that you're taking. This shouldn't be subtle. It should be clear that you're taking initiative in regards to people who might be on the edge of burnout or need to have more freedom to adjust their schedules, etc. These are proactive organizing principles, not passive organizing principles. Sorry, I just want to clarify that. This is something where one has to take the lead on it, not simply install. Sorry about that, Gabriella.
No, great, excellent. I want to talk about one more story before we close out here. And this is a Texas-based software company that was exploring opportunities to improve corporate culture. They lacked visibility into productivity habits across the workforce. They were concerned that data collection backlash. Now, I want to be really clear that I want to share this story not to talk about necessarily the improvements that they made in productivity along the way, for which existed. But what I want to talk about is the way that they engaged their workforce in this conversation. They collected this data and they put it in the hands of their employees. They allowed each individual to understand, own, and reflect on their own habits. And they also encouraged their employees to have conversations with their managers, raising concern around their own burnout, around their own training needs, around their own sources of distractions. And so I share this to talk less about productivity gains, which they had, but more about the cultural acceptance when you share this type of information openly and that you empower not only your leadership team to have visibility, but more importantly, your employees to take ownership of the way in which they manage their ability to be productive. Employees, to be clear, should understand what you're collecting and why. So how well do you ensure that employees understand what you're collecting and why? So for those of you, and this is an interesting poll because so many of you are not yet sure whether or not your organization does this, or your organization is not doing this. So I recognize this should be a fairly small percentage. I don't want to spend too much time on this poll, but I'm curious, for those of you that do this, do your employees know that you're collecting the data?
And why?
And why?
And the answer being we're collecting it for compliance purposes is sort of the weasel answer, even if it is a true weasel answer. I'm going to be curious about the outcome for this one too, or the output for this one too.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting distinction in me just reading this question, Michael, which is understanding that you're collecting it is really different than understanding you're collecting it and why, right? Because telling your workforce that it's being collected and giving no more insight beyond that curtain can be quite disruptive, right? It lends itself to a whole lot of questions. But what we really want to know is, are you explaining why you're doing this? Because when you explain the why, you're then accountable for taking action on the data that you're collecting.
Exactly. But this is why, and forgive the use of the word, this is why the shtick we're talking on is empowerment. You know, this is not just we're collecting data, we're monitoring. This is empowering. The sharing of that data, the example that you offered from that Texas software company, that's about giving employees, giving the users, giving the people you're collecting the data from insight into their own value, time, contribution, etc.
Sure, and we talked a lot about this in the first webinar of our 3-webinar series, Michael, which is that empowerment is closely aligned to both trust and accountability. And this is the why lends itself to the accountability that exists here as well. So let's close out the poll and see what we have.
Very interesting. I'm intrigued by the depends on the employee. The people who answered that one, please contribute in chat anonymously if you'd like. The third, I don't know, we don't do this, is key. And honestly, the sign of success of these sorts of webinars is that 1/3 becomes only 10 or 15% going forward in the next 12 to 24 months. But really, really interesting. And we certainly want to hear from the people who believe they're doing a good job. We want to know why you're doing a good job and how you're able to do a good job. Gabriella?
I mean, I would echo those sentiments. I would love to sit down and have a conversation with those of you who have said depends on the data, right? And being able to, picking and choosing what data you share as it pertains to this topic lends itself to some risk around how transparent you're truly being, right? There are always moments where some data is more confidential than others, but when it pertains to the expectation that each of your employees do their role in being productive, it's really important that we're as transparent as possible. So I want to talk a little bit about that, as we close out here. If we close out this poll and we look at the final framework, it's this framework around the fact that employees should understand what you're collecting and why, and that exists across a spectrum. We recognize that all cultures are different. From one culture to the next, you might have different ways of communicating, different ways of being open, transparent. You might be within a very certain specific phase within your within your organization's life cycle in which you are less transparent on some things than others. But what we're saying when it comes to this topic, you really want to find yourself on the spectrum of informing your employees, engaging them, and or empowering them. When
if I can just quickly interject, people on participating in this, you should look at this matrix and you should see which ones you're in. You really should do that, because that's going to offer you insight into whether this is a path you need to go further on or whether you need to get more value from where you really are.
And the journey really sets itself too, Michael, right? I mean, you might begin this journey of adopting these new metrics and find yourself in the more of the informed or the engaged columns, because that's what you, after doing an assessment of your culture and your environment, that's what your environment can handle. But as you build that trust with your workforce, as you take those actions to make light of why you've collected these insights, you really find that those who adopt metrics like these are on a journey to more of the empowerment side of the house.
And I'm going to be curious in the conversation that follows. I can easily imagine scenarios where there are certain organizations that say, we're perfectly happy to have an informed workforce, we're perfectly happy to have an engaged workforce, but we want the managers and the leaders more empowered than the workers and the associates. I'll be very curious to see how that conversation or perception evolves, whether that's a minority perception or a mainstream perception.
Great. Well, I'm eager to get to the conversation. So let's close us out here with some key takeaways. New ways of working demand new methods of measurement. Workforce first insights are a necessity for organizations that seek to manage business performance as well as employee well-being. That is what sustainable productivity is. It's the achievement of not only your business performance, but it's the safeguarding of your employees at the same time. And then finally, transparency and trust are foundational to employee empowerment. And without it, productivity is at risk. So before we get to the Q&A here, which I think we're right on the cusp of, what I want to highlight is, as Michael mentioned throughout the conversation, is that this is part 3 of a 3-part webinar series. Part 1, we were joined by Melissa Swift of Mercer, where we assessed morale and mindset as key components of wellness and well-being and contributors to productivity. In part 2 of our webinar series, we were joined by Josh Klein, a culture expert and product innovator, where we explored how identifying and enacting cultural values can empower employees. And now today, Michael and I closed out this 3-part series with more of that practical conversation around how to bring productivity measurement to life in your own organization using these workforce first metrics. So I'm excited to get into the conversation. I encourage, to those of you who missed part 1 and part 2 to sort of go back and see how we've brought this all together. But for now, let's really dive deeper into how we can operationalize these concepts in our organizations today.
Well, Gabriella and Michael, thanks so much. Very interesting insights there. And I'm going to dive right into the Q&A because we've got some really great questions here. And I want to start with questions that ask for specific examples about the kind of data that's being tracked, and ask for examples. We had a few audience members asking, can you provide a few examples of actual digital or outcome-based metrics and how they are calculated?
Yeah, I'll take that first one, right? These are conversations.
I would hope so, Gabriella. Yes.
So the short answer is that different solutions and different organizations track different types of behavior. It's really important that you're mindful that you select a solution that ultimately allows you to collect enough information to collect those, to get insights into those behaviors, but not so much information that you've now gone into what we distinguish as more oversight than we do insight. You want to avoid being in that oversight category. So to get more tactical or to get more detailed on your question, which is what types of data is this? What type of the data that we talk about is we talk about how technology is being used, who's using it, how often it's being used, is it being used in a very clear set of processes, or is it being used on an ad hoc basis? That type of technology usage sheds insight into things like training needs and onboarding deficiencies, right? Maybe someone didn't get the onboarding they needed, and you were able to look at the usage of their technology to see where those gaps existed. Other types of data include data around context switching and focus behaviors. So if you look at someone's particular activity, you can see how often were they pulled into a messaging application when they were trying to do something in Excel. Right. That allows for great coaching opportunities for your manager to be able to say, hey, what can we do to make sure that when you're in Excel, you can be in Excel, and when you're in Slack, you're in Slack? And what can come out of that conversation is, no, that's how I collaborate. I always go to this person and ask for help. Well, the truth is they could be distracting that person, or they could not be, and they're collaborating on Slack. But the point is that those are the types of insights that lend itself to really powerful conversations that ultimately fine tune the way in which your organization operates.
You're absolutely going to, just to build on what Gabriela just said, you're absolutely going to see more blurring of the lines between sustainable productivity and helpful performance analytics and for performance review. If I could just kick it to a slightly higher level, a lot of the things that we're talking about now fall under a category called employee experience. And for virtually every single organization that participates in MIT exec ed programs, or that I do advisory work with, or that I conduct research with, one of the most important questions that they are seeking to answer is, what kind of correlations are there between quality of customer experience and quality of employee experience? Does improving employee experience lead to better customer experience? What aspects of trying to improve customer experience degrade or decay or interfere with employee experience? How do we create this kind of alignment? I don't know the answer to those questions. That's why they're being researched. The point, though, is you probably want to answer those questions with more data rather than less data. So this desire to, how do we know we're creating the right kind of employee experiences and that customers are getting value from that? That's going to require the kind of monitoring and measurement and insights that Gabrielle is talking about here, and we're talking about here. And just to finally make this point, what are the cultural and organizational principles there? What kind of transparency do you need? What kind of actions will you take? How do you want to share the details of those employee experiences? I think those are important takeaways, not just for HR departments, but for leaderships.
Here's a question about how to ensure that the data collected is representative of each individual's well-being. I'll read the question verbatim. When tracking and monitoring human-centered indicators, how can we ensure we have a good representation of each individual's well-being? Wouldn't the process invite people to share their lows instead of their highs? This question seemed to fit right into that, that whole category of employee experience.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just going to make a quick comment on this. I love that question, but my word love is in single quotes, okay? Because this is where the point that Gabriela makes about trust is so important. If you're teetering on the brink of burnout and being overwhelmed, you're juggling a lot, as so many of us, all of us have had to do. Are you comfortable and confident that sharing your lows is not going to lead to reproof and being sidelined, but that your organization is going to treat you with respect and professionally, and with at least a minimal amount of actionable compassion? That's the huge question. There are people and organizations where you're exactly right. People are going to conceal rather than reveal how they feel. And that's why we're talking about this. That's why what we're talking about here is so important. Because if you really monitor well, you will be able to detect those lows as well as those highs, as well as the median. Sorry for going on so long. Gabriela?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go on longer, right? I think for me, it was stated in that question, which is sharing your lows.
Right.
We want employees to be sharing. We want them to share their lows, and we want them to share their highs. And if we don't have managers who are in a position yet to have those very real conversations and handle them appropriately, that's an additional webinar, right? On making sure that your management has the ability to interpret data and gather context in a way that's productive and thoughtful and empathetic. The idea here is that we can't afford for our employees not to share, because what you get when they don't share is you get exits and attrition.
Right.
You get burnout and fatigue. You get low engagement. And so the idea is that managers don't interpret that data as low equals disengagement. Low equals a need for an effective conversation to understand whether or not there's a training gap, low engagement because there's something going on in the relationship between the manager and the employee where they're not aligned. I mean, the idea is to ask questions with curiosity, not ask questions with judgment. And that's what this data allows you to do.
But because I'm an academic, I'm going to give you a curiosity. This question basically suggests a minimum of $1 billion worth of research, which is if people do not disclose or if people hide their lows, does that make for a better churn employee departure predictor or a less better predictor on that? So where does withholding information undermine your ability to predict employee turnover, people's willingness to leave? The information that's withheld more predictive than the information that's disclosed? This sounds like a hypothetical question. I assure you it's a real world question, and it's probably a real world question for the majority of organizations represented in this webinar.
Let me do one more question about data collection before we move into some of the interpretation and process afterwards. But here's a question. What data specifically are you collecting regarding how technology is being used? For instance, the number of hours in a particular application?
Yeah, I mean, this is a highly configurable question, so I'm going to give you an answer, and I want to put the asterisk that this can vary from solution to solution and from user to user. But the technology usage that you're looking at is just that. How much time is being spent in that application? How is it being used? Sort of what are the main pages that are being used in that technology? And then who's using it? So if you have, 30 licenses and you have 3 users a month for 3 minutes, that's the type of data that you can see to know you either have a training deficiency, a communications problem, a change management issue, or you just don't need the technology, right? And so that's the type of insight that you need from that technology to be getting to some of these more human-centered metrics.
Do you recommend using data for performance evaluations? This plays into the need for transparency.
It's a data point among many is always my vast answer to that. I absolutely, as Michael has said before, that data helps power more effective conversations. But if you use the data in a way that if you use only a single data point, don't gather context and can't see the bigger picture, then this becomes really challenging. I know, I'll give you one quick example where I see this data used in the performance management process by watching people set focus goals. So my focus goal is to have 3 hours a day of uninterrupted focus time. And then the manager works with that individual on how to unlock that time. That's where you see it as more of a performance management piece of data point. Break time. Hey, I want to make sure that you're taking at least 2 breaks a day and going for a walk. I want to see you off Zoom and outside so that you can get that reprieve that you're asking for. That's where you really see it as part of the performance discussion and less about a way to make a judgment from a performance standpoint.
My answer is going to be orthogonal to Gabriela's here. We've done research on this in a prior incarnation, and the real tension that occurs when you gather more data in the performance analytics context is, are you creating space for professional development as well as performance analytics? How do you balance these things? It's unfair to say, well, your performance is a little lower down, but that was because you were taking classes in this, or you were part of working cross-functionally with teams that you had never worked with before. So you really, and this is in the spirit of transparency and action and insight and sharing, you have to cleanly draw distinctions between performance analytics as performance and performance as part of professional development. So there's a tripod here now. There's the wellness aspect, there's the development aspect, and the actual quote unquote hardcore performance aspect. At least managers and leaders in organizations have more data to better assess the trade-offs they're prepared to encourage between those things.
We have a very interesting question here from Peter. Has neurodiversity been considered in your recommended metrics and insights?
I'm not going to speak for Gabriela. I will say that different neurotypes and personality types, extroverts, introverts, do you have personality adjusted or cognitive predisposition adjusted recommendations. I think that's going to become a hot area. There are legal implications in America. We have ADA kind of issues, but do I believe that as our ability to collect data gets better and people's willingness to discuss their cognitive styles, their neural styles differently, do I believe we will have more bespoke ways of developing and managing and working with people? Yes, I do. But for specifics, I'm going to turn to Gabriela because she represents a company that does do that.
Sure. I'll talk. I mean, this is a fantastic question, and I'm glad that it was asked. We, when I think about our own solution, I'll be very specific in saying that we are extremely reluctant to ever say what a role or an individual should be working, right? Or what their behavior should be. We've stayed clear of things such as, very, hard boundaries on archetypes or role types that should be achieving 7 hours a day or achieving 3 hours a day. What we care to see is we care to see things like dips and trends in the data, or trends in the data that show those highs and lows and those out of the norm behaviors that can be reflective of, as I've said time and time again, training needs, engagement needs, time for that effective conversation so that you can provide the support. But we do not give the you should be doing this. What we do is we train on taking an assessment of your flexible working style and then setting your own goal or having a goal set alongside your manager that is indicative of how you work best.
We have a question here. The word burnout has been repeatedly used. Are you implying that existing productivity measures overexploit workers and managers?
No,
One can have burnout independent of measures. That may be more of an issue associated with culture or tasks associated. The question that I think, I'll take the liberty of reframing the question. Is it a good idea for organizations to get ahead of burnout, fatigue, disgust, exhaustion, rather than allow it to achieve a point where an employee basically says, no more? I would argue the answer to that is yes. To what extent do you want to have predictive infrastructure around challenges like burnout, fatigue, and being fed up?
Okay. How do you see organizations adopting AI-powered technology to improve productivity that leans into a human-centric way?
I mean, I think Michael just touched upon it when he used the word predictive, right? So how can you use data like this to understand to what degree is a variation in the trend of behavior truly a sign of disengagement? How can you know that, okay, here's the pattern for disengagement. We see more distractions, less consistency in start times and end times, a sporadic use of applications. All of these are different types of insights that you can collect from this data, but this becomes a lot more powerful when you have a model for declines in engagement that ultimately could lead to attrition. So you use this AI-powered sort of solution to ultimately say, okay, I can catch this and have a conversation before stage 3 or 4, which is where the person's already made up their mind that they're going to leave.
Right. I am going to be self-serving in this answer. I wrote a book on recommender systems, recommendation engines, and I think and I'm going to use this phrase deliberately, the choice architectures that those AI systems, machine learning systems support is key. I think that if we take empowerment seriously, what we want those AI ML systems to do is to make recommendations, to give advice, rather than say, you've worked too hard, stop. Do you want the algorithm to be your boss? Is that empowering? My immediate visceral reaction is no. So as important and powerful as I believe AI, ML technologies and techniques to be, I think how people are experiencing them, the kind of advice and guidance they get from them, as opposed to the do this or else aspect, I think the interfaces are going to become much, much more important. And we're just in the beginning of those phases right now. We're just in the beginning of that design.
So agree. I would expand on that and say that you can't get there without collecting the data on an ongoing basis. You just
Absolutely.
can't get there, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that if we go down this direction of giving advice to your employee to, ways to focus better, or ways to, check out at 7 p.m. rather than go until 11 because the last 3 days they'd gone till 11. That advice only comes from the ongoing collection of this data, as
Absolutely.
opposed to giving that advice in June at the end of an engagement survey on data, on feedback that they gave you back in March.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
I just want to loop back to the clothing company example that you gave, Gabrielle, because we have two very specific questions around that, and maybe you can clarify something here. Why were the employees more productive? Was it stronger boundaries between work-life balance, commute time, privacy in the home, as opposed to people annoying them in their cubicle? The second question is, the findings of the apparel company found increased productivity from workers at home, which we often hear. A significant challenge is managing variability in remote productivity, especially for workers on the highly distracted end of the spectrum. We find a need for differentiated responses. Any insights here?
Sure. So those are two very long questions. I'm gonna take one at a time, and if you can remind me of the second
Sure, of course.
as I finish the first, that'd be helpful. So the first one is all of the above, right? So we find this goes back to understanding the individual. For some people, it's purely just being able to have the choice, and they wanted to work from home, and so they were able to work from home and they were more productive. For others, it's less distractions in the cubicle, shorter commute time, no commute time, etc. I certainly am not in a position to know, across, I would be remiss to say for that entire organization, they benefited because they didn't have commute time. The truth is that when you looked at the data, they were able to be more productive for a variety of reasons that fit the way that that organization operated. They had the right tools in place. They had the right operating conversations that they needed to have, which you still need to have alongside this data in order to ultimately be productive at home. The second question, remind me if you don't mind.
The second question, and we'll ask this very quickly as we're coming to the end of the hour here, but the findings of the apparel company found increased productivity from workers at home. A significant challenge is managing the variability in this remote productivity, especially for workers who might be highly distracted.
Of course, yes. I thank you for the reminder. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's the variability piece is a really important one to touch upon, because that alone can stunt productivity if you don't have people on at the same hours, throughout the day. I've found that in customers that I've worked with, that core hour solution is key. But defining when those core hours should be is another fantastic use case for this data. So I know in our own organization, we were able to look at when is everybody typically on, and how can we make those our core hours? Because oftentimes what you'll see companies say, well, it's 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock based on where our headquarters is. And that's not where the overlap should be. And that's not where the overlap naturally occurs. There absolutely are challenges of flexible working schedules. But when you use data like this, you can find a way to naturally accommodate those challenges, as opposed to force a policy that isn't necessarily the most likely to be successful, but instead is the easiest to convey.
Okay, great. Well, we have come to the top of the hour. I want to thank you both for some really interesting real-life information and insights into this very top of mind topic. And thank you to our audience. Gabriella and Michael, thanks so much. And thank you to Active Track.
And
Fantastic.
Thanks to our audience. I look forward to seeing the comments that were entered in. It was a pleasure. Cheers.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.